Hi there, and welcome to this month's edition of Real Estate Matters with myself, Ayse, Clare, and Clare Girton. Welcome,
Hi, Ayse.
Clare. Hi, Clare. This is a show about matters in real estate, that real estate matters and is important, and how real estate really affects us on the local level with local neighborhoods. And for some, as you know, real estate is their largest investment. So both Clare and I are residential realtors focused right here around the main line and surrounding areas. And right now we're in some really interesting times. We continue to be. We aim to bring you actual stories, scenarios, and some terms that may assist in the understanding of residential real estate. And we hope to also bring a little bit of humor along the way.
Absolutely. And not only are we bringing some humor, but we also like to bring our feedback and what we're learning as we do this.
Always learning, Clare.
Always learning, which is our motto. Thanks, Ayse, for getting us started. This is our first show for this year, for this 2022. And 2022 has started off with a bit of a bang when it comes to real estate.
I would say, can I insert a quick stat?
Please.
Despite... And the stat is coming from our local multiple listing service, which houses almost all of the real estate information residentially.
And inventory.
Yeah, and inventory, thank you. In January, despite such low inventory numbers, and despite a slight tick up in interest rates, prices have not come down at all. And it remain pushed up. And I was in all of the, I guess, looking back 18 months, that prices were at the highest this past January of 2022.
January, winter.
Exactly.
And also days on market are super low, which means, spring market's here and it's February 10th today.
Yeah,
so,
I do think so. The spring market is here.
So, and maybe because of some of those reasons, which is interest rates. And again, another show.
Yes.
But today's topic is one that I think is really fascinating. I think we're going to have a great conversation. But, real estate encompasses a whole lot of things. And a lot of times people, when they think about selling real estate or buying real estate, they think, oh, I love homes. I like to see them. And
the interior, the design.
The design. And I like to, or I'm ready to sell. What am I going to do? So all of this part of the process, what am I going to do to get it ready for the market, is absolutely important and part of the process. But there is this critical moment when a seller puts their home on the market and buyers come to that seller and to that home and say, I would like to buy it. And that when they agree on the terms and the contract begins. So when both, or is executed, when both sellers and buyers agree on the terms and the contract is executed and ready to settle. So that moment takes some work, and it takes some negotiation.
Finessing, work, negotiation.
Finessing, work, negotiations, all of it.
Strategies.
And so today we're going to actually dive into that, where we like to call it the art of the deal. Literally the deal. What is that both buyers and sellers agree on, and how does that happen? Because it doesn't happen like that.
Sometimes.
That's so true. Sometimes it does. Rarely does it happen like that. It usually...
And it doesn't just happen once often.
Oh, so true. Such a good point.
There's multiple stages that we then really need to reconnect and have these discussions and renegotiations.
And often you could be under contract, you have everything worked out, you think it's going along, and something pops up, like an inspection report that showed something that you had no idea, or a mortgage contingency that had some interesting things happen, or an appraisal gap. So all these things that come along cause us to revisit, as buyer's agents and listing agents, revisit those terms and have to renegotiate. So it's constantly being reevaluated and negotiating.
Oh, that's a great word, that reevaluation by buyer, seller, listing agent, buyer's agent, mortgage company.
All of those things. And until those contingencies, that's what they're called, is contingencies are satisfied, you still are negotiating, or you still could be negotiating.
Absolutely.
So that, I think that's really an interesting interesting point is that it's not just a quick. It can be, but that
one and done.
So many things are involved, and you and I are excited to talk about a specific story today, just to kind of illustrate one example of how a negotiation transpired.
Yes, we have many stories that we can resurrect here, but we just selected one that may have been fresh on the mind, so to speak.
Okay, and before we delve into that story, something that you and I talked about earlier before the show, which I think is so paramount important, is the best negotiations and the best situations where both parties win-win is based on a courteous and constructive process, not a contentious process. So oftentimes people think, well, I will win a deal if I'm hard,
bully, so to speak,
or stubborn, and we have found that it's really the other way around. If we keep communication and constructive ideas on how to get to that place where both parties are happy.
That win-win piece is so key, right?
So key. I mean, really, and especially now, when there's disinformation and there's things out there that make us feel like second guess ourselves and our positioning. So it's really important to stay. What is our position and why, and what's behind that?
Yeah,
and then get to that place where, well, what's the position and why? What's behind the other party?
So part of that, in my mind, then is preparation for that negotiation. Once you know,
that's a good point,
right? Okay, we have two people that may not agree, right, on something, whatever it might be. What are some things that we can do to help prove our point or prove our position? So preparation is key, and then delivering that with that courtesy, respectfulness, open communication to a degree without maybe compromising a
perfect,
a stance or whatnot.
A position.
Yeah.
Without compromising a position, and deliver it to both parties. So that's why I think representation, I know you feel the same way. It is so important to, when you're working with another representation, is to be on the same page with how you are going to go about that. So communication between agents.
That's so important, because you can never always be on the same page in regards to
terms.
The outcome, the terms, right? You're representing your party, the other agent's representing their party, but being on the same terms of the communication level. You said it. And that's why, to me, there's art in that. Because you're still wanting to and needing to have that stance for your client, yet deliver that in a meaningful, impactful, calm, communicative, courteous way.
Amen. Yes.
Not as easy as we make it out to be.
And it's not, but if you go into it with that attitude, and it really does, you do find that you can have some really terrific, and we're getting to the place where, the pandemic, we weren't allowed to come to the table together, but I think that's coming back, where buyers and sellers can come to the table and say, I'm so glad that we got here and enjoy this house as much as we have, and et cetera.
Absolutely, despite negotiations.
Yeah. Okay, so the story that we are going to talk about today was a real true story. And why don't you, start in and kind of tell us give us some background, and then we'll dissect from there.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. So working with a home seller for a long-term townhome she had purchased, and she was planning to move back in with her family to help out with the family. So it was pure of what she wanted. There was no need to sell, right?
Yep.
Great, I'm willing to help out. She said, this is my plan. This is what I'm going to do.
How long had she been there?
She had been there about 12 years.
Okay, so a decent amount of time.
Yeah, and entire home was stucco. Now this is a townhome community, so stucco attached to stucco attached to stucco. And she was so good, upon initial discussion, she said, I said, let's think about doing a pre-listing, moisture or stucco inspection just to be prepared. She said, listen, I have one better. I've already done one Why I said, oh, well, a couple years ago, the neighborhood, there was talks of some challenges with the stucco and moisture. So I got one done. Great. Can you send it to me? No problem. So I took a quick look as we were ready to list, and I was like, meh, let's, the market was moving pretty swift.
Right.
Didn't want to not be able to capitalize for her on that market. She said, let's go. We said, let's go. We ended up, attaching that moisture inspection. Again, no work was done, just the moisture inspection to the listing, and thinking, okay, most likely buyer's going to get an inspection done on their own one that's more current day, since this one is now a little aged, 3 years. Finding, though, that buyers were getting a little caught up in the report and how they would move forward with the purchase of this home in a very attractive community.
Can I stop and ask a question? So just kind of thinking about that scenario, in hindsight, now always 2020, you felt so good about that it was going to be price positioned to sell. This house was attractive. It had a lot of things going for it. And that inspection report could have been thought of as a positive, which was like, here it is. You already have some information.
Absolutely.
But because it had aged 3 years, it may have, it did, send a little bit of a red flag, would you say, to some of the buyers, because it existed.
It existed, and there was at that point no game plan to tackle. Upon further look at that report,
right,
it looked like, okay, now what?
There's
we
something
need
to do.
We need to have an action plan. And we didn't have one at that point.
Right.
It was like, let's list it, see what would happen, where the buyer's head's at,
right,
and then we'll talk and we'll reevaluate. Seller and I were on the same page.
Okay.
And then we're learning, okay, this seems to be a stumbling block.
Right.
We're not seeing what we want, which is the offer.
So how long did it go before, how long was it on the market?
Give or take 45 days.
Okay, so in this market, that's a lot.
Quite some time, right?
Right.
That's ancient. So connected with the seller again. Okay, we've got nothing going on here. What do we do now? I said, this report's aged. Can you agree with that? Yes. Are you okay if I send this to an inspector that I know? In the meantime, she was actually working on trying to get estimates based on that report. That was proved to be very challenging, because in the stucco world, that was a very small problem based on the report we had.
Sure.
And a lot of the vendors in the stucco world, they're looking for the big jobs, the bigger fish. This was a smaller repair. Now, I tell you, smaller, we're still talking thousands of dollars, mind you.
Yeah.
But to the stucco vendors, it was smaller. So I had, I decided to reach out with the seller's permission to a very well-trusted stucco inspector, moisture inspector. He doesn't fix it, but this is mainly what he does. He was able to give just like an unbiased report of what he read in her 3-year-old report. And he said, okay, looking at this item needs to be done, and roughly you're talking maybe $18,000 to $20,000. So that was helpful, because at that point we had nothing to work on to communicate with the other parties, that now we were like, okay, we need to have that game plan. So just as we were about to call, another person, okay, here's the report, here's what we know we need to do, give us an estimate, so-and-so. I think we had just maybe gotten a verbal one at that point, figuring out what to do, enters buyer.
Before that, were you thinking with the seller, okay, we'll put this estimate in the MLS so that buyers would have an idea?
Potentially. I had just finished discussing it with her.
Maybe you would have done that.
Yeah, we didn't get that far. However, we were, because I didn't know if we were going to get it done at that point, or if the seller was open to credit. We had shared that information with buyer's agent as soon as we recognized there was interest. Hey, this is, where we're at. We just got this fresh information. Here's some numbers. Everybody going in with eyes wide open.
And then buyer's agent said, great, thank you.
Great.
Buyer, here's an offer.
Right, here's an offer. Wonderful. Thanks for that information. We're going to take it.
Right.
Great, wonderful. the offer was a good offer, very good offer, and it had language where the buyer was still allowed to conduct a secondary inspection, obviously, for today's market. Got it, because the old report was 3 years old. Understood.
So the offer, the listing price was
$595,
and the offer came in
about $585.
So very good offer.
Very good offer.
So 10,000 apart.
Exactly. And the offer that came in did not specify seller to do this,
right,
to perform this. It was buyer can perform a moisture inspection test and still have the right to ask the seller for a credit,
right, or
reduction in price, or terminate.
And that was built into the contingency. So that meant
Yes.
that the buyer had so many days, 10 days typically, to do those inspections before you got to that point of actually negotiating.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And totally agreeable with the seller.
Right.
We expected that to happen.
Okay, and that was agreeable to the seller because
Absolutely.
they were expecting it. They thought, hey, okay, we got a stuck thing.
Yeah,
okay.
with expectation conversations behind the scenes,
Right.
we were like, bring it.
Okay.
Nothing to hide. We shared with you lots of information.
Okay.
Let's do it.
All right, so now we're under contract.
Yeah.
10,000 apart, and
10,000 apart. Meanwhile, the initial estimate that we had just gotten had come in around, as I said, 18 to 20,000. Now, inspector comes in, which just so happened to be the same inspector vendor that I had leaned on as just somebody who's so well-rounded, knows their stuff. Buyer's agent used him as well, which I thought perfect. Randomly. I mean, we're in a smaller market, but there are plenty of them out there. So I was like, okay, this is great.
Okay.
He already has a great working level of where we're at with the home. If anything comes up, it's just a matter of what happened in the past 3 years that we need to solve.
Okay.
So he performs the inspection, and now, a couple more pieces came in. Buyer's agent was able to get an updated estimate. Now we're talking more around 30,000.
Okay.
So we were 18 to 20, now we're 30.
Well, and as stucco disintegrates, and if you do have some moisture over time, that is actually going to increase.
It certainly could.
It could. And then, so that wasn't a surprise that remediation was going to be a little bit more expensive.
Well, to the seller, I guess it was a little bit of a surprise, because in her mind, the report was only 3 years old. In my mind, it was like 3 years old, ancient, right? So everyone has a different perspective, but a little bit more than she anticipated. Okay, now we're at 30,000.
Okay.
Right? That's a big chunk.
That's a big chunk.
Yeah.
All right. So then at this point in the story, the buyer comes back and says,
yeah, they want a credit, a big credit. I think they wanted a credit of maybe $25,000.
so they asked for almost all of it.
Yeah, and I thought, oh great, seller's like halfway out the door. She is like pretty much packed up. She had some some things to finish up on. And all right, great, a credit is much easier. Now we're in the winter time, and winter and stucco work, that's just not a great mix.
Right.
Great, they're gonna go interview the vendors. They're going to go
Take care of it. And
take on the risk if there was more, right? Once you're peeling off, if there's more damage than the inspector noted. They're going to take on that, taking on the aggravation of the work being done. God bless.
Okay.
I thought, great, seller, they're just looking for a credit. They're just looking for a credit.
Right.
How does this sit with you? And seller, no.
Yeah. And why do you think why was she at that point?
So when I had asked her about that, and she was like, whoa, too big. I've already taken 10,000 off.
Oh, so she thought that $10,000 difference was part of what the credit.
It could have been.
Yeah. Okay,
it could have been.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I already came down. I just replaced the HVAC. That was another 12. We did let them know how much that base amount was. They didn't build into their offer. And all of a sudden over here, a storm came by to my other property. Now I need, some money I had aside. I need to earmark money for that over there. So they can absolutely still buy the home. They've got all of the information they need. But at this point, I'm not coming down in my price.
So her position actually changed by more information. Meaning like,
interestingly enough, in kind of holding back the reins a little bit.
Right.
And buyers are looking at it from a different perspective where they're like, oh, letting, even more money they're now having to spend they initially thought.
Right. Okay.
So I totally understood, after further discussion, I understood more where the seller was coming from. She was communicative. I asked questions and she was willing to share the information because I too thought she was going to make some sort of concession for the stucco.
Now, in hindsight, for the buyer's representation, we don't know. Aren't that agent, but maybe they would have thought differently about how to write it into the offer with anticipation, so that the seller had a clearer idea. We will ask for a credit up to $15,000.
Yeah,
if it shows.
Yes, took it another step further to kind of buffer those expectations.
That's a thing to remember. As we go through this, is like, okay, what could we have done up front?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that upfront is so important for everybody.
For everybody.
If you want things to move along a little bit smoother.
But in this case, it didn't happen. There was kind of some assumptions made on both parts.
Sure.
That happens a lot.
Yeah.
So then you went back to the buyer and said she's not moving.
Yeah, she's not moving, and buyer's agent just threw a hissy fit. And what I thought you said, and I did say that, however, her stance has now changed.
Sure.
We didn't get anything in writing. I was of the same mindset, but now she's saying this.
And she's the seller and she makes
Yes, and this is why. And this is why.
Right.
The buyer's agent, as upset as she was, allowed me to speak. I followed up with an email to her, like, I hear you, I get it.
Yep.
But now this is, even though it's hard, but this is now the information that we have to go and then share with our clients.
And here comes the courteous and constructive part, which is, we know that you're upset for your client, and I'm upset for my client, but what can we do to help both parties understand what would be constructive, fair, and a way forward?
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then she went back, and I'm sure she felt like, ooh, I wish I would have.
She did.
I'm guessing at this, but
I think she did actually verbalize, I wish I would have built in something instead of the contract.
Okay.
That's fine, but nothing we can do about it now. They thought about it. And we had multiple conversations over probably a 24-hour span.
Okay, that's important.
Yeah, which I really liked because, okay, now did you say this? Now what do you think about this? But I'm not really sure. So we had multiple conversations, texts, calls, emails, to be sure we were fully understanding. Mm-hmm. And
did you feel that de-escalated the buyer's agent's kind of her own?
It did, because I said, I followed up that night and I said, clearly you're upset. I totally get it. Maybe we'll talk in the morning and see how you feel then, right?
Right. And in the meantime, the buyers and sellers are kind of in their just holding pattern.
Yeah, in their holding pattern. And, next day came around and she's like, thanks for letting me cool my jets. Like, knee-jerk reaction. Yeah. I get it. No apologies necessary. It's not news you wanted to hear.
Right. Courteous.
Been there. Yeah, been there, done that.
So the buyers ultimately decided after that.
Yeah, they decided, not what I've loved, but they decided to terminate. And granted, at this point, we were, I would say, 90% of the way towards closing from the standpoint of the milestones that we need to hit.
So financing was in process.
A homeowners association docs were in the buyer's hands. They were aware of that.
Wow.
We had the appraisal waiver, which was a really nice bonus.
Yes, concession. Yeah.
Exactly. Inspections, again, we were talking about inspections. This was like almost our last piece. We didn't have a use and occupancy inspection to worry about. So we were really towards the tail end here.
That's a really good, interesting point.
Yet still we got a termination.
And termination doesn't feel good for either side.
No, because I knew the buyer still wanted the home.
Right.
And I knew the seller still wanted to sell.
They had a family on the way, right?
Yeah, the buyers did. And the seller, again, was, more than halfway out the door.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then when you got that termination, and it's a unilateral signature, so the seller doesn't have to sign it.
Correct.
It's just the buyer in the way that contract was set up.
Correct.
So you got that termination, and you let a day or two, everyone knew about it. You let a day or two go by, and what happened after that?
Yeah, reached back out to the seller because we have to figure out now what?
Yep, sure.
No buyer now what? Do we relist the property as active on market? without any game plan of what's going to happen with the stucco, do we make the status of the listing temporarily off the market and get the stucco work done? Now, again, she's like almost in the throes of moving, so she had other kind of pressing things happening. We talked a little bit more about what was going on with her life and this and that, and that was very helpful. We also talked about, you know, the cost that she's paying every month for owning this home, and we almost left the conversation as she was going to do the stucco work. She wasn't afraid of that. She was going to tackle the stucco work. At a later time, again, we're still in winter months, so it would have to be at a later time. She was just going to hold on to the property. We could relist it, and then I could tell people we were going to relist it. She was going to work on the stucco. But then I said to myself, well, you're going to be already moved out of here. So basically you're paying for an empty home. What are you paying every month? I did some quick math. I'm like, by any chance is it around $2,500 a month? This is HOA fee, insurance, you know, mortgage payment, etc. She's like, that's about right. I said, okay, well, best case scenario. Best, maybe impossible case. If we turned around and listed it tomorrow and got a buyer tomorrow, right?
Right.
Just go with me on this. The earliest we would settle is 2 months. That's $5,000, which just so happened to be the gap that we were at between seller and buyer when it came to more negotiations for the stucco.
And you actually did do some of that. We missed that part of the story. You did do some negotiations where they were like, all right, we'll take a credit for...
just a little bit more happened. Yes, thank you.
$10,000 and
okay. Thank you for that. And so at the end of the day, the buyers had come up a bunch in regards to the credit. They were like, fine, I'll take just a little bit of credit or reduction in purchase price. Yeah. And so she said, oh gosh, I didn't realize, I didn't think about that. Very smart woman, you know, and I didn't think about that. And I said, yeah, that makes sense. I said, do you want to sit on it and kind of think on this more? And she's like, no, let's go back to the buyer. I mean, I know they terminated, but let's go back to the buyer. I'm like, look, to me, things aren't done until they're done. I know we got a termination, but we also know that there's some motivation.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and for her. And we were able to, what do they call in doctor's world where they charge these things and
the paddle.
Yeah, we were able to do
resurrect,
that. Yes, resurrect things, and everybody was able to move on. But I think when you take the time, I guess, to kind of like the art of the deal, right? Getting back to that, when you take the time to hear the positioning and the reasoning of why one is doing what they're doing. And in that situation, the seller and I were able to connect on that end, and the co-op agent we were able to have a reciprocity of communication. It really helped the situation tremendously.
And while you're saying that, I'm thinking about being the buyer. So if I'm the buyer or the buyer's agent, it's hard to terminate. They did want the house. But in doing that, they actually got the seller to say, wait a minute. Right? So the termination,
pause and think.
Even though the termination was not what they wanted, it actually facilitated the negotiation.
Yeah, exactly. In some manner, even though some would say after the fact.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
After the fact.
After the fact, but it may not have happened. You know, unless they said we're out. You know, then they may not have gotten to that negotiation where both parties ultimately were happy.
Yeah, ultimately.
Yeah. So then
they each had the same end, you know, sell the home and buy the home.
So just for simple math, listed at $295, it sold for $280.
Well, $595. I'm sorry.
Forgive me. $595. It sold for $580.
Correct.
Which is $15 less.
Yes.
The total amount for the stucco is about $30.
Happened to be at that point, the estimate was $30.
So that ultimately they ended up splitting the cost.
So to speak. Buyer didn't see it that way.
Right. Buyer didn't see it because they were going to have to come up with something to.
Yes.
But in terms of the bottom line, they got the house for $15 less than
that's how the seller looked at it. The buyer looked at it a little bit differently. Interestingly enough, that's how it all boiled down. But a lot of communication, a lot of conversations, even just about one negotiation.
Sure.
You know, there were multiple side conversations and backs and forth, you know, to be sure we were understanding.
And learning along the way on all parts.
For sure.
So you didn't know that she had other expenses for her other house that kind of came up.
Had no idea.
Until you were pushed on this, then
Yeah.
that brought that out. And that
Yeah.
happens, I think, a lot, is, kind of reasons for why people position themselves the way they do.
Yeah, and then it's up to
Sometimes getting to the bottom of that.
Yeah, it's up to us to ask, well, why? Well, why? I thought this, and now this is happening. Why is that? And so it's up to us as the agents to ask questions, to press,
Yes.
to be curious
Yes.
with clients and other co-op agents. That to me is the art of the deal.
So agree. And it's different for every single one.
Sure.
Right? Because everybody has their own lens and their own perceptions and something we talked a little bit about earlier is when you're going through these negotiations and you're in those kind of acute moments, is that the right word? We as humans start to make up stories in our brains, narratives to fill in things that we don't know. So it can happen where you start to make up stories about another party because it helps fill in the blanks. And what is really important is for us not to do that and to say, wait a minute, let's not make up stories about something we don't.
Stories, assumptions, just to back up what your mindset is, what you're perceived.
Let's go back. Let's focus on what we know. We know that these buyers have an offer on the table. I'm just trying to, like, from the seller's point of view.
Yeah.
And this is where they are. They know that there's stucco remediation. Let's stick with what we know. We know that you want to sell this house, right? You're halfway out the door. Let's focus on what we know rather than, the buyers have so much money they can afford it. Well,
Right.
that's irrelevant when it comes
Very irrelevant.
when it comes to the buyer's positioning.
Absolutely.
So if you can't, we don't want to make up anything that doesn't.
And you had reminded me how much we do that in life, just in general, and that just by making things up in your head, assumptions, what have you, to back up what you think is true,
Right.
it really can only take you into a rabbit hole sometimes. And then gets you nowhere.
And anybody anywhere,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
it's not helpful, but it's hard to do. But if you take the time, and I love this idea of, like, let's sleep on it. I mean, I've done that. I've learned that over the years,
Yeah.
that sometimes is the best. I had one that was terminated at 9:00 at night.
Right. And you're tired at the end of the day.
And for good reasons. And I had the buyer side. And the next day, the seller agent called back and she said she slept on it and she's okay.
Yeah.
She's ready to go. So, exactly. Sometimes it takes that. And that's after we had negotiated for days.
Yeah, and that can get tiring sometimes
Well, it sure
mentally.
does.
Yeah.
It sure does. But you do get to that point where sometimes you have to say no for some negotiation to continue.
Oh yeah,
Or you
that's
have to
sometimes a negotiating in itself.
Exactly.
Piece,
Yeah. When I think about my kids,
As we talked earlier.
But getting to that, circling back on being constructive and being courteous is really super important in, as we go through these negotiations and deals.
Yeah, to fill in one tip that you had actually said earlier as we wrap up is, sometimes you have to take the other party's hat and wear it for a little bit, right? I love that, and just jump in their shoes for a bit, so to speak, to see if I were the other party, is that, like, does that response make sense? And oftentimes, like, yeah, I see their stance. Do I like it? No, but I see.
That is also different than making up stories. It's actually being, under trying to say, what would it feel like if I was that person, which is different than making up stories.
Definitely. Oh, yes.
But sometimes I think that could be confusing, right? Is that, what is it? Rather than saying, like, why are they doing that? Than saying, well, how would it feel if that was me that was happening to?
Yeah.
I think that helps a lot. Yeah. Between sellers and buyers.
For sure.
Super helpful.
Great perspective, as always.
As always. All right, that was good. How much time? We're good?
We're wrapping it up.
We're wrapping it up. I find this to be so important and so interesting in our profession. And it keeps me doing it, because every interaction I have with buyers, sellers, other agents, keeps me learning and keeps me wanting to represent this profession in the most professional way possible.
And you do that so well.
Well, I was going to say that's why I hang around with you, because you do it so well.
I love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Yeah, next time.
Until then.
Until
thanks,
then.
Claire.